Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to stand up and come with me right now.
Excuse me, did something happen?
Hey, she's been sitting there quietly the whole time. I'm not trying to cause any trouble. Could you at least explain what the issue is? The issue is that you're not cooperating. I'm asking a question. This doesn't look right. Here's my boarding pass, C3A, business class. You see it right there. I'll need you to step into the aisle while we verify something. She refused to follow instructions. I asked why I was being asked to leave.
Ma'am, could you come with us, please?
The flight attendant's voice cut sharply through the quiet hum of the cabin. Ma'am, I need you to stand up and come with me right now. Several passengers looked up at once. A few phones lifted slightly from laps as people instinctively began recording. Danielle Carter slowly turned her head. Excuse me, she asked calmly. The flight attendant's expression was tight and impatient. You heard me. Gather your belongings. You need to leave the aircraft. A ripple of confusion moved through the rows. Danielle blinked once, clearly stunned but trying to remain composed. Leave the aircraft, she repeated quietly. Why? You're creating a disturbance, the attendant said coldly. I haven't said a word since I sat down. Well, a complaint has been made. Danielle looked around the business class cabin of the nearly full flight from Chicago to Los Angeles. Passengers stared back at her with curiosity, some with concern. A middle-aged man across the aisle leaned forward. She hasn't done anything, he said. She's been sitting there the whole time. The flight attendant ignored him completely. Ma'am, she said again, louder this time, stand up. Danielle sat perfectly still for a moment. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her handbag. I'd like to know what this complaint is, she said. That's not something we're discussing right now. So you want me to leave the plane without telling me why? Yes. A murmur spread through the cabin. Danielle inhaled slowly. She had spent most of her adult life dealing with difficult situations in hospitals where panic, anger, and fear were everyday emotions. She knew the value of staying calm. Still, humiliation crept up her spine like a cold wind. I have a ticket for this seat, she said gently. Seat 3A. The attendant crossed her arms. We're aware of that. Then I don't understand the issue. Ma'am, the attendant snapped, this is your final warning. Danielle looked at her boarding pass, again on her phone, almost as if checking reality itself. 3A, business class. She had boarded early, greeted politely by the same crew. Nothing had been wrong then. Now suddenly the entire plane was watching her. A young woman 2 rows back whispered to her friend, why are they doing this? Her friend whispered back, I have no idea. Danielle finally spoke again, her voice soft but steady. I'm not trying to cause trouble, she said. I'm just asking for an explanation. The attendant turned toward the front of the plane. Melissa, another crew member called from the galley, do you want me to call security? Melissa didn't hesitate. Yes. The word dropped like a stone into water. Passengers gasped quietly. Danielle felt heat rise into her face. Security, she said. For what? Melissa didn't answer. She simply pressed a button on the wall panel and spoke into it. Gate security needed on board immediately. The tension in the cabin thickened. A businessman near the window muttered under his breath. This is ridiculous. Danielle slowly stood up. Not because she believed she had done anything wrong. But because she could feel the situation slipping into something ugly. Her movements were slow and controlled as she reached for her handbag. Ma'am, you don't have to go, the man across the aisle said. Danielle looked at him and gave a small, grateful smile. It's okay, she said quietly. I don't want to delay everyone. Her calmness only seemed to irritate Melissa further. Well, that would have been easier 10 minutes ago, she muttered. Danielle heard it. But she said nothing. A few seconds later, 2 airport security officers stepped onto the plane. The cabin went completely silent. One officer looked around. What seems to be the problem? Melissa pointed directly at Danielle. This passenger needs to be escorted off the aircraft. The officer studied Danielle carefully. She didn't look disruptive. She didn't look angry. She looked embarrassed. "Ma'am," he said gently, "we're going to need you to come with us." Danielle swallowed. "Can someone please tell me what I did?" Melissa answered before anyone else could. "You refused crew instructions." "That's not true," Danielle said softly. "I asked a question. You refused to stand up when asked." "I was trying to understand why." The second officer looked at Melissa. "Did she threaten anyone?" "No." "Raise her voice?" "No." "Then why exactly are we removing her?" Melissa hesitated for half a second. "Because I said so." A few passengers openly shook their heads. Someone whispered, "Unbelievable." Danielle felt the weight of every eye in the cabin pressing down on her. She picked up her bag. "I'll go," she said quietly. The officer nodded respectfully. As Danielle stepped into the aisle, someone near the back of the cabin said loudly, "This is wrong." A few people clapped softly in support. Melissa glared down the aisle. Danielle kept walking. Each step toward the aircraft door felt heavier than the last. She had worked 16-hour shifts saving lives. She had delivered devastating news to families. She had held strangers' hands while machines kept them breathing. And yet nothing had prepared her for this quiet humiliation in front of an airplane full of strangers. Just as Danielle reached the front of the cabin, a voice suddenly crackled through the overhead speaker. "Hold on." The deep voice of the captain echoed through the aircraft. "What's going on out there?" Melissa grabbed the intercom. "Just a disruptive passenger, Captain. We're removing her now." There was a pause. Then the captain asked a simple question. "What seat?" 3A. Silence followed. A long silence. Then the captain's voice returned, slower this time. "Did you say 3A?" "Yes, Captain." Another pause. Longer now. Inside the cockpit, Captain Robert Hayes stared at the cabin door with a strange feeling in his chest. 3A. He had flown thousands of flights. But something about that seat number tugged at a memory he couldn't immediately place. He stood up. "Hold departure," he said to his co-pilot. Then he opened the cockpit door. The entire cabin turned as the captain stepped into the aisle. Passengers whispered. "That's the captain. Why is he coming out?" Captain Hayes walked toward the front of the plane where Danielle stood beside the two security officers. For a moment he simply stared at her. His eyes narrowed slightly. Then widened. "Wait a second," he said slowly. Danielle looked up. Their eyes met. Recognition flickered across both of their faces at the exact same moment. The captain's mouth fell open slightly. "No way," he whispered. Danielle blinked. "Robert?" Gasps spread through the cabin like a sudden wind. The captain laughed once in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." Melissa looked confused. "Captain, she's the passenger causing the—" "Stop," the captain said firmly. The entire cabin froze. Captain Hayes stepped closer to Danielle. "You're Danielle Carter," he said. "Yes," she replied cautiously. The captain ran a hand through his hair. "I don't believe this." Melissa frowned. "Captain, with all respect, this passenger refused." "Do you have any idea who she is?" the captain asked quietly. "No," Melissa said stiffly. "Well, I do." The captain turned slowly toward the passengers. His voice grew louder. "Ladies and gentlemen, the woman standing here is the reason I'm alive today." The cabin erupted into confused murmurs. Danielle shook her head slightly. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "Yes," the captain replied, emotion thick in his voice. "I do." Captain Hayes looked around the cabin slowly, as if making sure every single person was paying attention. Because what he was about to say mattered. A lot. You said she was disruptive, he asked, turning back toward Melissa. Melissa shifted uncomfortably under the sudden weight of the captain's stare. She refused to follow instructions, she replied. Danielle spoke quietly. I asked why I was being asked to leave. Captain Hayes nodded once. Then he turned fully toward the passengers. 5 years ago, he began, his voice steady but heavy with memory, I was in a car accident outside Denver. The cabin fell silent again. My car was crushed between 2 trucks on an icy highway. I don't remember much, just the sound of metal and glass and people shouting. He glanced at Danielle. But I do remember waking up in the emergency room. Danielle lowered her eyes slightly. Captain Hayes continued. The doctors told me later that my heart had stopped twice on the operating table. A quiet gasp came from someone in row 4. They said I probably wouldn't have made it, if one doctor hadn't refused to give up. The captain looked directly at Danielle. That doctor was her. A wave of murmurs swept through the plane. Melissa's face slowly drained of color. Danielle shook her head gently. Robert, you don't need to turn this into a scene, she said softly. The captain let out a small laugh. A scene, he said. Danielle, the last time I saw you, you were standing over me with blood on your gloves telling the nurses to keep my heart beating. Some passengers stared at Danielle in disbelief. You remember that? She asked. Of course I do. You were barely conscious. I remember enough. The captain turned toward the security officers. You can step off the aircraft, he said calmly. There's no reason for you to be here. The officers exchanged a glance. One of them nodded. Yes, Captain. They stepped off the plane. Melissa suddenly spoke up, her voice defensive. Captain, we still have a passenger complaint regarding the seat. Captain Hayes turned slowly toward her. What complaint? A passenger believed she was sitting in the wrong section. Danielle raised an eyebrow. I showed you my ticket. Melissa looked flustered. Well, yes, but... But what? The captain asked. Melissa hesitated. A passenger behind Danielle spoke up loudly. She showed it twice. Another passenger added, we all saw it. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Captain Hayes held up a hand. Let's clear something up, he said. He turned to Danielle. Do you mind showing me your boarding pass? Of course. She handed him her phone. The captain glanced at the screen. Then lifted it slightly so Melissa could see. Seat 3A, he read. Business class. Melissa's mouth opened, but no words came out. Captain Hayes handed the phone back to Danielle. Thank you. Then he looked at Melissa again. So explain to me why the doctor who saved my life was being escorted off my airplane. Melissa shifted awkwardly. I was responding to a passenger concern. What concern? She said the woman looked like she was in the wrong seat. For a moment the cabin went completely still. A young man near the back muttered quietly, did she really just say that? Danielle felt a familiar ache rise in her chest. She had heard that sentence in many different forms before. You look like you're in the wrong place. You look like you don't belong here. But she had learned long ago not to let anger control her. I didn't want to make a scene, Danielle said calmly. Captain Hayes looked at her with a mixture of admiration and sadness. You didn't, he said. Someone else did. He turned back to Melissa. Which passenger made the complaint? Melissa hesitated again. Then she pointed toward row 2. A woman wearing oversized sunglasses quickly looked away. Captain Hayes walked a few steps down the aisle. Ma'am, he said politely, did you raise a concern about this passenger seat? The woman shifted nervously. Well. I just thought, she might have been confused. Confused about what? About business class. A low groan rippled through the cabin. Captain Hayes took a slow breath. "Let me ask you something," he said. The woman adjusted her sunglasses. "Yes." "Did you see her boarding pass?" "No." "Did she speak to you?" "No." "Did she do anything disruptive?" "No." "Then why exactly did you believe she didn't belong in that seat?" The woman opened her mouth. Closed it. Then muttered, "I just thought maybe she was supposed to be further back." The meaning hung in the air like a thick cloud. Captain Hayes stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned back toward the front of the plane. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, "we're going to take a brief moment before departure." Passengers watched him closely. Captain Hayes looked at Danielle again. "Dr. Carter," he said warmly, "I owe you more than I could ever repay." Danielle smiled faintly. "You already repaid me by surviving." The captain shook his head. "No. You gave me something bigger than that." "What's that?" "A second chance." He turned toward Melissa again. His voice was calm now. But there was steel underneath it. "I want you to listen carefully," he said. "Yes, Captain," Melissa replied quietly. "The woman you tried to remove from this aircraft spent 6 hours in surgery fighting to keep me alive." Melissa swallowed hard. Captain Hayes continued. "And during those 6 hours, she never once looked at me and thought I didn't belong in that hospital room." The cabin was so quiet that even the distant airport announcements outside the plane could be heard faintly. Danielle shifted slightly. "Robert," she said gently, "this really isn't necessary." "Yes," he said again, "it is." He turned back to the passengers. "I want everyone here to understand something." People leaned forward in their seats. The person sitting next to you on a plane, or walking past you in an airport, or standing beside you in a grocery store. He paused. "You have no idea what they've done with their life." Danielle felt her throat tighten. Captain Hayes gestured toward her. "This woman has held more lives in her hands than most of us ever will." He looked at Melissa again. "And today she was treated like she didn't deserve a seat on this plane." Melissa's voice came out barely above a whisper. I didn't realize." "That's the problem," the captain said quietly. The woman in sunglasses shifted again in her seat. A man beside her shook his head. "You should apologize," he whispered. She stared down at her lap. Meanwhile, passengers all over the cabin were looking at Danielle with new expressions. Respect. Admiration. Even a little awe. Danielle felt uncomfortable with the attention. She preferred quiet hospital corridors to crowded airplanes full of staring strangers. "Captain," she said gently, "I really don't need recognition." Captain Hayes smiled. "This isn't recognition," he said. "What is it?" "Correction." He looked around the cabin again. "Because today something almost happened that should never happen to anyone." Passengers nodded quietly. The captain stepped closer to Danielle. Then he said something that made the entire plane lean forward to hear. "Dr. Carter," he said, "I'd like to ask you a question." She looked curious. "What is it?" "Would you do me the honor of taking a different seat today?" Danielle blinked. "A different seat?" "Yes." "Why?" The captain smiled slightly. "Because the seat I have in mind is a lot better than 3A. Danielle looked at him with quiet confusion. "A better seat?" she asked. Captain Hayes nodded. "Yes." She glanced back toward the business class seat she had been sitting in only minutes earlier. Her bag was still there, tucked neatly under the seat as if nothing unusual had happened. "I'm perfectly fine where I was," she said. The captain shook his head. "No, Danielle," he said gently. "After what just happened, you deserve better than fine." Melissa stood near the galley, frozen and silent, as the tension in the cabin continued to shift. Passengers were still whispering to one another. Did he say she saved his life? She's a doctor. 6 hours of surgery, he said. Danielle felt every word floating through the air around her. She turned back to the captain. Robert, she said softly, I didn't save your life alone. There was a whole team in that operating room. Maybe, the captain replied, but you were the one leading it. She gave a small shrug. That's just my job. And this, the captain said, gesturing around the plane, is mine. He took a step back and looked at the first-class section. Most of the seats were already occupied. Business leaders, a retired couple, a young tech executive typing furiously on his laptop. Captain Hayes raised his voice slightly. Ladies and gentlemen in first class, I'd like to ask for your attention. Heads turned. The cabin grew quiet again. I'd like to introduce someone to you, he continued. Dr. Danielle Carter. Some passengers offered polite smiles. Others were clearly curious. She's the surgeon who saved my life 5 years ago after a highway accident nearly killed me. That got their attention. The tech executive slowly lowered his laptop screen. A gray-haired man near the window leaned forward. The retired couple exchanged surprised glances. Captain Hayes continued speaking. Earlier today she was asked to leave this aircraft because someone believed she didn't belong in her seat. A few passengers frowned. Danielle wished the floor would open and swallow her whole. She hated being the center of attention. But the captain wasn't finished. I believe she deserves a far better welcome than that, he said. Then he looked at a young man sitting in seat 1A. Sir, the captain said politely, would you mind helping me with something? The man blinked. Sure. Would you be willing to switch seats so Dr. Carter can sit here for the flight? The young man didn't even hesitate. Of course, he said, already standing up. Seriously? Yes, the captain replied. The man grabbed his laptop bag. Honestly, that's the easiest seat swap anyone's ever asked me for. Light laughter rippled through the cabin. Danielle immediately shook her head. Oh no, I can't take someone else's seat. The young man waved dismissively. Ma'am, he said with a grin, after hearing that story, I'd give you my whole row. More laughter followed. Captain Hayes gestured toward seat 1A. Dr. Carter, he said warmly, welcome to first class. Danielle hesitated. For a moment she simply stood there, unsure what to say. Finally she sighed softly. You're not going to let this go, are you? The captain smiled. Not a chance. She laughed quietly for the first time since the whole ordeal had begun. Well, she said, in that case, thank you. Passengers began clapping. At first it was only a few people. Then the applause spread row by row until the entire cabin was filled with it. Danielle felt her face warm with embarrassment. But she also felt something else. Relief. The kind that comes when a painful moment finally begins to fade. She moved toward seat 1A and sat down. The young man who had given up his seat leaned toward her before walking away. Dr. Carter, he said quietly, thanks for saving this guy's life. Danielle smiled. I'm just glad he's still flying planes. The man laughed. Me too. Meanwhile Captain Hayes turned back toward the galley. Melissa was still standing there, pale and stiff. He walked over slowly. Melissa, he said calmly. Yes, Captain. I want you to think about what happened here. I will. No, he said quietly, I mean really think about it. Melissa looked down at the floor. Captain Hayes continued speaking, but his voice remained steady and controlled. When you work in this industry, you meet thousands of people every year. Yes, Captain. Some are wealthy. Some aren't. Some are loud. Some are quiet. He paused. But every single one of them deserves respect. Melissa nodded slowly. You're right. The captain studied her for a moment. Do you know what the most dangerous assumption a person can make is? Melissa shook her head. No. Assuming you know someone's story just by looking at them. She swallowed. I understand. I hope you do. Meanwhile, several passengers had begun speaking quietly with Danielle. The retired woman across the aisle leaned over. Dr. Carter, she said warmly, what kind of surgeon are you? Trauma surgery, Danielle replied. Oh my goodness, the woman said. That must be intense. It can be. The woman smiled kindly. Well, I'm very glad you were there for the captain. Thank you. A man 2 rows behind spoke up. Do you really work 16-hour shifts like they show on those medical shows? Danielle laughed softly. Sometimes longer. The man whistled. That's incredible. Another passenger leaned forward. My brother's a nurse, she said. I know how hard hospital work can be. Danielle nodded. It's challenging, but it's also meaningful. Captain Hayes returned to the cockpit doorway. Before stepping inside, he turned back one last time. Dr. Carter, he called. Yes. I'll be making an announcement before takeoff. Danielle raised an eyebrow. Should I be worried? The captain grinned. Not at all. Then he disappeared back into the cockpit. Passengers continued whispering. One woman leaned toward her husband. Can you believe all this happened over a seat? The husband shook his head. Some people see what they want to see. A few minutes later the cabin speakers crackled again. Captain Hayes' voice filled the aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Passengers settled back into their seats. Before we depart for Los Angeles, I'd like to share something with you. Danielle closed her eyes briefly. She had a feeling she knew what was coming. 5 years ago, the captain continued, I was lying on an operating table with doctors telling my family I might not survive the night. The cabin was silent. One surgeon refused to accept that outcome. Danielle sighed quietly. She worked hour after hour to repair injuries that should have ended my life. Passengers listened closely. Because of her, the captain said, I was able to go home to my wife, and watch my daughter grow up. Danielle felt a tightness in her chest. And today, he continued, that same doctor was almost removed from this aircraft because someone assumed she didn't belong. No one spoke. For the record, the captain said firmly, she belongs anywhere she chooses to sit. A few passengers chuckled softly. On behalf of myself and this airline, he continued, Dr. Danielle Carter, thank you for giving me a second chance at life. The cabin erupted into applause again. Danielle covered her face with one hand, laughing quietly. When the clapping finally settled, the captain added one last sentence. And if anyone here ever doubts the power of compassion, just remember the person sitting in seat 1A tonight. Danielle shook her head with a smile. Robert, she muttered under her breath. But deep down, she felt something warm and steady spreading through her chest. Not pride. Something quieter than that. A reminder that even the most painful moments could sometimes turn into something unexpectedly beautiful. Outside the window, the engines roared to life as the plane began to push back from the gate. But the story wasn't quite over yet. Because several rows behind Danielle, the woman in the oversized sunglasses was sitting very still. And she was staring straight ahead with a look that was beginning to shift from irritation to something that looked a lot like regret. The plane slowly rolled away from the gate as the engines hummed louder beneath the cabin floor. Passengers settled into their seats again, though the atmosphere on the aircraft felt very different now. People kept glancing toward seat 1A. Toward Danielle. A few smiled when their eyes met hers. Others nodded respectfully. Danielle wasn't used to this kind of attention. In hospitals, gratitude usually came in quiet moments, A handshake from a relieved father, a tearful hug from a patient's mother, a whispered, "Thank you," in a hallway. This was very different. Across the aisle, the retired woman spoke again. "My daughter's a nurse," she said warmly. "She always tells me trauma surgeons are the calmest people in the room." Danielle smiled. "That's usually the goal." The woman leaned forward with curiosity. "Were you really operating for 6 hours on the captain?" Danielle nodded slowly. "It was a bad accident," the woman's husband added quietly, "but you stayed." Danielle looked out the window briefly. "That's what doctors do." Behind them, the young tech executive spoke up. "I have to ask," he said. "Did you know he became a pilot again after the surgery?" Danielle chuckled softly. "Oh yes. You did?" "He came back to the hospital about a year later." The retired woman gasped lightly. "He did?" Danielle nodded. "He walked straight into the trauma unit carrying a giant box of donuts." Laughter spread through the nearby seats. "What did he say?" the tech executive asked. Danielle smiled at the memory. "He walked up to the nurse's station and said, 'Is the doctor who refused to let me die working today?'" More laughter followed. "And then?" the woman asked eagerly. "I told him if he kept bringing donuts he'd ruin everyone's cholesterol levels." The retired couple laughed loudly at that. Meanwhile, several rows back, the woman in the oversized sunglasses shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had removed the glasses now. Her face looked tense. The man sitting next to her glanced over. "You know," he said quietly, "you should probably say something." She frowned. "Like what?" "Well, maybe apologize." The woman crossed her arms. "I didn't do anything wrong." The man raised an eyebrow. "You complained about her seat." "I thought she was confused." He shook his head slightly. "You didn't think that. You assumed it." She looked away toward the aisle. The truth hung in the air between them. At the front of the plane, Danielle was pouring herself a glass of water when she heard footsteps approaching. She turned. It was Melissa. The flight attendant looked nervous. "Dr. Carter," she said quietly. Danielle looked up. "Yes." Melissa took a small breath. "I owe you an apology." Danielle studied her face. The woman looked genuinely shaken. "I should have listened when you showed me your ticket," Melissa continued.